2 weeks ago, and we're actually staring at the finish line right now. So again, appreciate everybody being here. Senator Powers, good to see you. Thank you for being here too, and obviously Representative Whitson during session. I know there's a lot going on, as you guys were just alluding to, but other folks on here have a lot going on too, and I know this is important to all of us. So thank you for you guys and your attention to this. So we'll probably jump into this. So Ginger is going to help me quarterback this a little bit because I told her today, please feel free to jump in if I start going down the wrong path and we really cover or don't cover some things that we need to today. So I kind of wanted just to give you guys a quick reset about what we met about last week. So we had a chair meeting. I don't know, Ginger, was it Thursday or Friday of last week with Commissioner Schwinn? Was really productive. And they gave us some additional guidance around kind of where we are and what the next steps look like. And to be very frank with this subcommittee, from what we have submitted and the information that we received from our group, the hay is pretty much in the barn. We've gotten a lot of good feedback. We have compiled that Ginger has used. To be very honest, we have had to strip away some things that might have been of a personal nature, whether a student's name was mentioned or a family member's name was mentioned. That wasn't something that we were wanting to include. We didn't take away from kind of the spirit of what the messaging was, but we certainly want to honor the individual and protect them. If it was a health, mentioning something about their health or ability, we did not put names in anything that Ginger has submitted. So if you do see something that's public and it does not have a name on there, I want you to understand why that was done. And kind of in conjunction with that, as we started looking at that, one of the things that Commissioner Schwinn mentioned that I think is really important for the group to kind of remember today, and as we move into the final day next week, and remember we're meeting a week from today for our final meeting. And Ginger, I'm going to mess it up, and I told you that 3 times this morning. Commissioner Schwinn brought up something that I think is incredibly important for us around funding versus spending and increases in funding. Ginger, can you quote back to me exactly what she said so I get it right? Because I don't want to screw that up, and I know that I was going to.
Yes. So when we think about this conversation that we're having, it's really focused on a funding plan versus a spending plan. So thinking about what are those components that we would want to see funded in the formula versus the various details about how we would want to see those funds spent locally by individual districts. And so some of those conversations come out later through some policy, and then some of those things are local, decisions to be made by individual districts. And so as we're having this conversation, it really is about that, funding plan to decide what are those components that need to be funded to help us decide what that formula needs to be.
Yeah, Ginger did a much better job than I would have. I would have completely messed that up. But again, that was a theme, and it was interesting. Again, it was not one that was directed just at this subcommittee. That was just a general direction for all of the subcommittees to make sure that we remember, and here's why. So as we're going through these exercises and as we've been starting to compile some of these public comments and feedback that's been shared at different areas all across the state, everybody that has been submitting, I shouldn't say everybody, that's not fair, but a lot of the submissions that have been made have been built around, you need to spend more money on this, as opposed to we need to make sure that we're funding this. So there can be a blend there where they kind of marry each other. I know that we've had those conversations about we really need to make sure that we're spending more on assistant principals or spending more on EAs or whatever that might look like. But there was pretty clear direction from DOE just to make sure that we still kind of hone in on the idea that this is a funding plan and not a spending plan. So if we are going to fund things, tell us some things that need to be funded around a child's education in whatever state or whatever county rather in the state that they're in. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that. So as we're going through this, and I think it was Anna a couple of weeks ago that mentioned, we want to make sure we give as much time as we can for discussion around these. I will caution you to let you know again, next week is really, we're pretty much done after today on the conversations around the funding. And the final conversation we're going to have next week is really around policy. And I see Ginger kind of nodding her head. I don't think that I was incorrect in interpreting that, but that was the messaging that we were given, was that, hey, you've got, one more meeting after your next one, and then we're going to be moving forward in conversations with the governor's office and the legislative branch around what this is going to look like. And I think Senator Powers was actually dead on. I don't think there are going to be changes made just for the sake of saying that we need to make changes. I know Carol and others are kind of nodding their head. Believe me, if it's working in some areas, you don't want to blow that up just to say, hey, look what we did. We blew it up, but we don't know what the new creation is going to look like. So there are going to be discussions around, okay, what does this look like if we do make some changes? Why are we doing that? So we can make sure that we articulate that instead of just saying, well, we had to do something. So I don't think anybody in this committee, and I think a lot of the other committees, felt the same way, that we want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence, but also making sure that if things are working for the subcommittees that we're responsible for, that some of those things don't get changed just for the sake of changing them because it sounds like a good idea. There needs to be tangible reasons to change that, and actually proof-based and data-based reasons to make sure that we're making those changes. So I'll kind of stop there and let Ginger go through a few of the things real quick, and then I'm going to pivot back and mention a couple more things as we start moving into the discussion phase.
All right, I'll go through this quickly. I know it's your all's favorite part of the meeting, so here we go. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. Brad, you've kind of already talked through these pieces, and I'll just skip us to this part, which you've also already talked about, what we'll focus on today, and then the next time we'll just be switching to really focusing in on those policy considerations. Just as a heads up on that, in your Google Drive, there is a document, Meeting 5 Recommendations document, and there are some policy pieces listed on the last couple pages of that document. That'll give you some idea of some of the discussions we may have during meeting 6. So I don't think we'll get to those today, but that'll give you some idea of some of the things we want to start thinking about and defining for, or considering as part of the defining moments for the policy under a new funding formula. So just want to put a plug in for that you do have that already at your disposal if you have some time to look at that before the next meeting.
Yeah, that's excuse me, that's perfect. Thanks, Ginger. And again, as Ginger just kind of went through, most of the feedback that we've gotten is already been documented. And then as we move on to discussion points for next week, you'll be able to review some of that and make sure that we're kind of falling in line with what they're asking us to do in meeting 6. So just real quick, I'll kind of stop there to see if the committee has any questions or anything like that before we kind of move into what was submitted to us and then kind of have some discussion around that. So I want to make sure everybody's clear. If there's any questions anybody's got, obviously raise your hand on the Teams window and I'll make sure that that I look for you. So I'm going to go really slow scrolling. Don't see anything yet. So, and that's okay. We'll go ahead and move on. So obviously if you do have something in there, just raise your hand and we'll make sure we stop. But a couple of interesting things that look like they came out of the discussion phase and the actual submission back to Ginger and myself as far as priorities for this subcommittee, I think number one unequivocally was RTI. Everyone that submitted feedback basically put that one at the top, which was really interesting. I wasn't going in necessarily expecting one thing or the other, but there was an overwhelming message from our committee, our subcommittee, that RTI was number one or number two for each individual based on conversations that we've had across the board. The other two that really had a general consensus kind of surprised me a little bit, not because there wasn't anything wrong with it or right with it, just didn't know kind of where this thing was going to fall. But the idea of gifted endorsed educators and gifted endorsed district coordinators also had a pretty overwhelming majority of folks that were saying that's kind of a must-have in the conversations that we need to be sharing with DOE as we move forward for our gifted students to make sure that their needs are being met and that there's actually leadership at the district level that would endorse programs for those students and better understanding about what those students might need that historically they either got at a really low level or just haven't gotten at all, depending on where that district was. And those were the two big ones that we submitted. The tougher part of the conversation really starts happening now as far as there were also a lot of 50-50. And we really want to be careful where, sometimes we dominate the conversation from our own lens. We've talked about that to say, hey, this is my life. This is why this matters to me. And other folks might not have that same type of exposure and don't understand it as much. So that kind of ranks down on what they've submitted. That's really what started to happen with the rest of these different topics. I'm going to look at it real quick. I've got some quick notes. There was actually a split, really almost a 50-50 line around gifted programs for students at the elementary level. There were folks that advocated as that's really something that we need to think about having. There were others folks that didn't necessarily place that as high in their own structure when they submitted it. So that was kind of mixed. Really talked about even the early grades, the K through 3 was kind of split. That's a little bit different because there's a bigger draft framework I think that we need to look at when it comes to K through 3. What does that mean? Is that for children with special education? Is that for gifted children? Is that for reading? Is that for dyslexia? All of the things that we've talked about before, I think really fall under that umbrella about, okay, that's a bigger conversation that needs to have because that's not only our students that we're responsible for, that's also traditional students, that's also English as a second language students, tons of different things that would fall under that. But that was also one of the ones that was kind of a 50-50 down the middle about, is this something that we need to say it's a must have, or is this something that we have, it's a nice to have, or things are okay kind of the way they are. And that was also kind of where we started seeing funding for professional development for educators, general educators around gifted learning, and for students with disabilities. There was kind of a split amongst our committee about, is that something that needs to be prioritized? Is that something that is a must-have, or is that something that's, yeah, it'd be great if we could get it, but it's not something that we've got on the top of our list? And then the last one, let me scroll down on my notes real quick, that was a split, was increased pay for staff, which I thought was really interesting, because I think a lot of people look at it, different levels depending on where you live. Your teachers might be paid a better salary than other areas, but I think that's really important for Senator Powers and Representative Whitson to know that there are folks that look at that in a different lane about how do we better increase pay for teachers, because I don't think that answer was folks saying, look, teachers are paid too much. I think they were just saying, in the context of what we're responsible for from this subcommittee, these are the things that are really high priority. And then I think we've also talked historically in the past about tying in, additional compensation for teachers that might have taken additional classes on how to educate gifted children or children with disabilities. So there are some unique things in there. I think that our legislative friends that are joining us on this can maybe take away from this and also have a conversation around. So I'm going to stop there. Ginger, I didn't know if you just raised your hand or not. I saw you. Okay, perfect. It must have been just you moving in the corner on my screen. Sorry about that. I apologize. There was one last one that I thought was interesting. It was also tied to pay. It was really split down the middle about pay for EAs, for classroom assistants, which I thought was interesting. Again, I didn't try not to go into this with a preconceived notion about what we were going to do or how people were going to fall one way or the other. But I wanted to let you guys know that was the feedback that we got from the committee. So we're not at the point, Carol, I'll jump to you right in 1 second. I just saw your hand pop up. Sorry about that. We're not at the point where we're not open to looking at some of these things and talking about them. We are at the point where we kind of have to, we can't blow this thing up anymore and really start over. This is, if all things were equal, this is what we're going to submit, or what Ginger has had to submit to DOE as far as our formal recommendations from the subcommittee. So think about that for a second, what I just shared. Carol, I'll go ahead and jump to you and see if there's others that might have some feedback or follow up.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I appreciate
Sure.
that. I just wanted to offer a little bit of context, particularly based on what you said at the beginning of this call, or what you did, Ginger, about doing a funding plan versus a spending plan, and one thing and another. So in my case, for example, I probably didn't address increased pay for staff or increased pay for paraprofessionals, not because I don't think it's critical, but because I didn't see that as a part of the role of this committee. If we're talking about how we develop a funding plan and a funding formula, our comments also say we think there needs to be a lot more money in general in education, but recognizing that that's not the purpose of this. So I just don't want us to put too much weight. And I would say that for you, Representative Whitson and Senator Powers, we're kind of split on increased pay for staff, because I think I didn't answer it because it wasn't relevant to the job.
Yep. So. No, it's a great point, Carol, and I certainly think it's one that needs to be taken in that context, that nobody is saying that we don't need to pay teachers or EAs any more money. The conversation was built around funding versus spending, to your point, and I think part of that funding might end up being spending, right? I mean, the legislature or the governor's office could make that decision to say, we're going to add additional compensation in here for certifications or for rural teachers or urban teachers, whatever that might look like. I think it's a great point to make sure that we're publicly being clear that this is not an indictment that anyone is saying teachers and EAs and others make enough money. It's a conversation around what we were asked to do. And part of that feedback, I think, centers around, what are we looking for from a funding perspective and a delivery of skill sets or educational opportunities for students that are gifted or students with disabilities. So good point.
Yeah, I'll just add to that I think some of the split came from whether it would be educators or if it would be staff outside of educators, which I think you also saw play out in that draft framework. So you saw educators show up as part of that base, but then you saw overall salaries outside of educators pop up in that additional consideration section. And so I think maybe some of the struggle that this group may have had as they, grappled with that also played out with other stakeholders as they submitted their feedback as well. And so that's probably a conversation to have, whether, any of that gets lifted up to, a full recommendation that, yes, we would push for this, or just the educator side. But just wanted to share that there is definitely context around both of those pieces and where that prioritization lies.
Yep. Hey, Jen, go ahead.
Sorry, unmuting.
Oh,
so I agree with Carol. The first thing that struck me when you were reading off your notes, and I want to also shout out to Anna for sending a detailed description of the hours of reading she did of the various feedback emails we received. So it was very aligned, very similar to what you were seeing as priorities. But it struck me that the first note I took was that this is a funding plan and not a spending plan. And a lot of those particular items sound like ways to spend the funding that is eventually given. And so I think, I don't know if it needs to be that the statement from our subcommittee is that we want to make sure this is fully funded at the base level and a high amount that's going to really support schools to make the right decisions for individual students. And then prioritizing adding those weights for various diagnoses and extra unique needs. I don't know if you all saw what Mississippi State just passed. They passed the START Act, which was strategically accelerating the recruitment of retention of teachers, the Act of 2022. And it had a bunch of pointers, but the main takeaways I got was that they are giving every Mississippi teacher a pay raise between $4,000 to $6,000 effective next year. Different things like that are really going to improve the quality of life for our teachers who are struggling right now. And also, give their state average of student spending a big boost, which being a neighboring state is going to look, there's going to be some comparisons made. So I think we need to be letting our senators and representatives know that needs to be kind of the base needs to be a real priority, that it is set at a comparable amount to where we're not in the bottom 5 out of 50 states anymore on what we're spending on our students, and allow the details to be determined at the school level and at the district level based on what those individual students need.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jen. Appreciate your feedback. Yeah, and in fact, when Ginger and I were talking, and I actually brought this up to Commissioner Schwinn myself, just conversations around sometimes the funding plan has to have the spending in it type stuff. I think to your point, we're saying, hey, if there's funding, this is areas that we need to have fully funded, or there needs to be conversations around what this looks like. And not to put words in your mouth, but I think that's kind of where you were getting at was, if we really do value this, then there are ways for us to show that from commitments financially, from the legislature and from others to say this is important to us, and part of that is fully funding XYZ and having those conversations. So appreciate your feedback. Hey, Anna.
Hey there, I appreciate everything everyone else has said here in the comments. I just want to make sure I'm understanding clearly. So when we're talking about this, obviously we need a bigger piece of the pie. We all agree about that. But I do think it is very important for this committee to call out certain things that do need to be funded. There's big concerns from the disability community that I'm a part of, that if we leave it up to schools and districts, there won't be funding, because there's kind of this misunderstanding, around dyslexia, around giftedness, about some of more of our niche disabilities as well. So I think that having those really spelled out is critically important, because I think our local districts are struggling getting that guidance right around certain disabilities.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and I don't want to pull Ginger into this, but she can vouch for me on this. We actually, in our subcommittee meeting, I specifically mentioned around those conversation pieces about what's a legal requirement, and make sure that we're continuing to use that as a driver in these conversations for students with disabilities, and Commissioner Schwinn and others were fully on board with that, understanding what the expectation was. And I was really encouraged by the conversation we had. Like I said, again, this was last Friday. So it's still kind of fresh in my mind about that. And there were conversations around reading, around dyslexia, around acknowledgement of students that might have really unique and complex needs, and the importance of providing not just funding mechanisms, but actual support mechanisms in place in districts to make sure that those children can be exceptional at whatever level that's going to look like. So a lot of what you sent, Ann, and again, I appreciate, I wish you wrote down everything in that email, which was great. A lot of your research, and certainly appreciate you doing that. Those things are being looked at. I mean, Ginger and I talk about it. We send them up and we make sure that somebody confirms that they've received it and looked at it. So all very good feedback from you and others on the team, both electronically and also verbally. It's getting looked at and it's getting read. And Commissioner Schwinn came directly to me last week and said, I really appreciate the feedback from your committee, because I'm reading boom, boom, boom. Like she is reading those, on her own. So I know we've got a commissioner that's invested in understanding and listening to our population. So very encouraged by that. Any others before we kind of move on? I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. I see, Carol, I thought you raised your hand, but you were just resting it on your lip. Yeah, sorry. I don't want to miss anybody. So we'll kind of keep moving on then, and kind of in the spirit of what we were just talking about around those kind of topics. And you really, Jen, I think you kind of keyed on something that I need to do some self-reflection on with Ginger, is how do we want to now deliver that message back as kind of our formal statement to say, this is what we believe from this subcommittee. So Ginger, maybe we kind of go through a little bit about what the feedback was from the committee, and we start tailoring that a little bit today, and then we kind of get, if we can get it wrapped up today, obviously we have next week, but next week's more towards policy, and presenting kind of what a unified message would be back from this committee back to the leadership at DOE and the legislature. I see you scrambling for the mic button. I'll give you a second. There you go. You had that look of Microsoft Teams fear, and I knew what that meant right away.
If y'all saw how many documents I had open on my screen and trying to navigate across those and get to the microphone. Okay, so do we want to go through some of these items and just see which ones maybe differ from what's on the draft framework to see what we would want to share as that feedback, and then wrap back around to say, you know, here's kind of the formal statement from the group.
I think last week it was helpful how we just brought up one and then discussed it, because I think some of them will be much faster. I liked how we did it last week.
Yeah, I think Anna, not to push Anna per se, but I want you guys to push back on me. I think there were some that, Ginger, we got pretty universal feedback about no, that I don't know if we need to cover. And Anna, I'm not saying we're skipping stuff. We're not. It was ones that we covered that were no's. So maybe we go back through, Ginger, kind of the ones that we just talked about, to say these were the kind of the ones that we did have some agreement, but not all agreement. These are the ones we know everybody, like RTI, we're welcome to discuss, but we really don't need to, because everybody prioritized that one as number one, and then the one right behind that. So we're really looking for those layers, kind of like 3, 4, and 5, to say, okay, what are our 5 key points, 4 key points, and not send over 11 with half of those being, well, some of us thought this worked. It's really some of the crux, like you just said, Anna and Jen, about a very direct messaging back to DOE to say, we want to be very clear so you don't misunderstand what we believe. And Jen, I think maybe, or Ginger rather, I think maybe if we go through those, we can get some more consensus and then craft a messaging back to the DOE, kind of what our mission statement is.
Okay. So I'm going to have us just kind of start based on what I have here on my screen with the notes, with just that top of the list. And it sounds like you all kind of already have some consensus on this verbally, but I just want to have it confirmed for my notes. And so that is around additional and increased pay for those paraprofessionals and educational assistants. So as a group, are we saying that we would prioritize that and have that as a priority in the base, or we would not? So vote yes for prioritizing.
Yeah, so what we'll do is, if we can, yeah, Anna just beat me to it. If you do believe that, again, I want to be careful. There's no right or wrong answers as far as what you believe. Just share that. If we can use those raised hands in the chat, that gives Ginger a better way to look at that, to say, yeah, we believe that. And especially if there's kind of an in-between there, it kind of lets us know. And I'm not voting, so don't,
Yeah,
I haven't put my hand up, but I'm letting them kind of come in there so Ginger can get a good look at them. Because again, this is kind of our last bite at the apple before we submit it. So we want to make sure that we've got everything down based on what we're saying.
So I'm struggling a little, sorry.
No, you're okay.
I mean, I think that this is absolutely critical, and it's really, really critical for students with disabilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Ginger, when you say it needs to be put into the base, I'm like, it needs to be considered. I think it needs to be considered in the weights around students with disabilities.
Right.
So that's different than, I mean, I actually have some opinions about other things that ought to go into the base, but I don't think this needs to go into the base. But I think it's absolutely critical to the weighting of students with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. No, that's spot on, Carol. I mean, that's what we've been having those conversations around, is Ginger, I think, and Ginger obviously can speak for herself much more eloquently than I can, but that's why we're doing this, to say, do we believe this is something that needs to be included in the base, or is this something that needs to be included in the weighted portion of the conversation? And as we go through that, Ginger, maybe that's what we do, to say, do we think it's a base? Because Carol, I think to your point, we raise our hand saying, hey, we think this is important, but it might not fit in the base. We think it needs to fit in the weighted portion, but we got to raise our hand right now. And maybe that's what we do, Gingers. We say, if you think it should be in the base portion, raise your hand. If we think it should be in the weighted portion, raise your hand on that. So I think, Carol, based on the head nods that I've gotten, a lot of folks believe it should be in the weighted portion of this as opposed to the base. So what I'm going to do real quick, if it's okay, is drop everybody's hands. And I think we're going to kind of ask that again, Ginger, around if you believe that this should be in the base formula. Can you raise your hand right now so we can kind of look at that?
Can I ask a clarifying question before we
Sure.
go? This is Leanne, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead,
Are
Leanne.
we talking about just educational assistants, paraprofessionals that work with students with disabilities, or are we talking about educational assistants across the spectrum of a school district?
Yeah, it's a good, I would guess, and again, I don't want to speculate based on 15 people in here, that when we're talking, we're thinking about educational assistants that assist students with disabilities and gifted students. So probably unique to our community. But I don't know if we'd necessarily be opposed to the idea that educational assistants are good for an entire school and bring even more value to an experience. Jen, are you raising your hand to ask something or to vote? Sorry.
I'm raising my hand to ask something, but Wendy Tucker
Sure.
had her hand up first.
Yeah,
already.
okay. Yeah, we'll go to Wendy first, then to Jen. Go ahead, Wendy.
Hi, thanks. My concern is over identification challenges. If you put this in the weights, you are incentivizing schools to place children with paraprofessionals. Potentially, I'm not saying they would do that, but I think there's national data from other places that have put that in the weight that would say it is a challenge. And so I don't know where the right answer is. If it's in the base, at least everyone gets it and you don't have an over identification concern.
Sure. Yep. Hey, Jen, go ahead.
So I had a similar concern, but I thought, just in the interest of time too, I wonder if it makes more sense to just have a statement that says, we want to fully fund the base at a high rate for what you've considered to be part of the base of the plan. And we want you to really consider various diagnoses as whatever their requirements in their IEP are, they should get a weighted amount for each specific requirement. Maybe just have it, because I feel like if we try to weight, yeah, like Wendy said, if we try to weight certain things, then there's going to be this weird perception of diagnosis or overdiagnosis or misdiagnosis. I think it really should be funded, but up to the individual's IEP team and the family and the diagnosis and what's actually needed for that child. And then the state and the schools will be able to provide it because the funding is there. I don't know how to make that kind of a blanket statement. It might even be easier than voting on all these individual things, because of course we're all going to have a different view. It might even make sense to have a teacher committee say, these are the typical things we see in an IEP that we can't get always funded, or that come across as items that are like must-haves. I think they would have a better idea maybe than us trying to, decide for each individual thing what makes the most sense, if I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I think, unfortunately, I mean, I hate to be that guy, but we're on such a time crunch that we might have to revisit this, even if we have to do it part of the time early next week, Ginger. We really need to get something concrete that's pretty universal right now. And I hate to sound like I'm dismissing it. I promise you I'm not. We just have been given direction. We need to get this back. But that's something to think about. So why don't, Ginger, we move on to a couple of the other ones I think that are probably going to be a little bit more universal, and let's get those on paper. And then if we've got some time today, we got 20 minutes. We can try to circle back on this, but we have to get something on paper that we can get over today, at least as a discussion point.
Okay.
That sounded really harsh, and I didn't mean it to sound that way. I'm sorry, but I don't want us to not have something by the time we end the session today. Go ahead, Ginger. Sorry.
Well, and I do think it's important to note that with the weights, there is that note on like tiers of services for the students with disabilities, which might support that, educational assistant piece within that. Like that might help with funds towards that. But looking at our next item on the list, the early grades piece. So previously that have I'm sorry, I'm having some internet trouble, and this is like the worst time of the day to have
Okay.
internet trouble. And so early grades, we had defined that as K3, and that a strong foundation is needed so that less funding will be needed later. So I think conversation about whether we want additional dollars to be put in the K3 grade band. And you might note that there is on the funding framework, the draft framework, there is a note about pre-K3 grade band that might be worth looking at and seeing if that is the direction the group wants to go. So we can give you a second to look at that. Or if this group sees that, you know, a different direction for how this group would define K3 supports.
Let me go back to Lori. You have a question there?
I do. So, and I'm missing the pre-K, I think, grade band. I obviously would say pre-K 3 is paramount. My concern goes back to what I've expressed on other calls, which is what are we're increasing funding for what? If we're leaving that up to the discretion of the LEA, I don't know that it's going where we want it to go. I mean, are there specific line items, like if it's pre-K 3 literacy, pre-K 3 social emotional behavior? I mean, or is it just we know that it takes more money to educate pre-K 3 than it does other grades?
Yeah. No, it's a good point, Ginger. I don't know if you can provide any context on that, but I'm tracking what you were asking, Lori, because Carol, I think, even said it in the chat. Now's where we're kind of getting into the devil of the details, and or that's really where the messaging is going to be. Is okay, we've got a general idea about what we believe, but we believe it if we know for sure in the details it's going to say X, Y, Z or whatever. And Lori, I know I can't speak from an authority perspective really to answer that question. Ginger, I don't know if you have any background on what Lori was asking either. Yeah, I don't know, Lori.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more about this group deciding what their feedback around that would be. And so I put in the chat what is in the draft framework. And so there may be something in that is the feedback from this group, or it might be something else. So you mentioned the literacy piece. There's also tutoring and intervention in there. I think part of it is that, you know, does it take more funds to educate students in those early grades to ensure that they don't have gaps that need to be filled later? So I think it is for this group to decide what their feedback around that is specifically.
Hey, Carol, I saw your hand, and then we'll go to Leanne and then Anna right after that.
Hey, thanks. I'm just so conscious that we have like 17 minutes, right?
Yeah, we do. You're right.
I
We need to, I would ask lovingly that we remember that. I hate doing that because I know it's important, but we do. Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
And so I just want to say, if something is a good idea, like lowering class size in pre-K through K or increasing pre-K, and even though there are risks, and the same is true for paraprofessionals and over identification, we've spent a lot of time thinking about the risks around a weighting system, but that's step 2. If it's a good idea, to be in the base or be in weights, I think it's a good idea. And then it's incumbent on all of us in the community to make sure that it's done the right way. So just saying.
Sure. Yeah. Hey, Leanne.
Hey, I like the language that Ginger shared there from that draft. I think this is a good idea. I think we need that extra push, that extra support in those early grades so that the students are given more success later. What I would like for us as a community, our community committee, I guess is what I was trying to mold together there, is to add a piece about high achieving gifted students within there, because the language there seems to really focus on supporting needs related to needing for struggling learners. So I think this is a great idea. I just would like us to add to make sure that that includes enrichment and opportunities and advancement for those high achieving kiddos, because we don't want bored children, and we don't want children getting anything less than their potential because we don't have the adults to support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, good point. Leanne? Did I lose Leanne?
No, that was me. I just finished.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just saw it pop back up for some reason. Anna?
I'm happy to definitely put in the early. I echo Lori about having those early years put in there. And I agree with Carol. I don't think we have to hash out every single detail. I think at this point we can really put in some of these things that we agree on. There needs to be support, and we can go to step 2 maybe next week just to get things. So I would love to see those. I think it's really about identification. And I'd also love to see that parapro pay and assistant pay included in our recommendations as well. And then we can kind of parse out what they look like maybe when we're talking about policy. But I think we all feel pretty strongly about those, just so we can get something on paper.
Yeah. So yeah, Ginger, to that point, Anna kind of pivoted to where I was going. Would you mind maybe reading the 3 or 4 that we've got and seeing if there's a general consensus that yes, we're comfortable with submitting that. And then to Anna's point, Carol and others, then we kind of really dive into that maybe a little bit today in the last 5 minutes, or even early next week if we can, and make sure we're comfortable with having something on paper, though, because we got about 13 minutes. If you don't mind reading those, I think that'd be good.
Yeah, so we have the pre-K through 3rd grade grade band, that wording as it is on this draft framework. So I won't read all that to you, but add in language to address gifted students so that it's not just focused on those who may be struggling or falling behind. And then we also have, and that would be, are we saying that should go under, I'm not sure which category. So that might be something we need to revisit, but we're advocating for that to be in the funding formula, not just additional considerations. And then we also have additional and increased pay for paraprofessionals and educational assistants. And right now that's either in the base or maybe taken care of in a way, depending on which students we're talking about.
Yeah, so what we'll do, Ginger, if Ginger, you're okay with, I think what we'll do is, like Carol just wrote in their base, so we've kind of got a framework. And as we're moving through this, Ginger and I can send out something very basic for next Tuesday, just so everybody can look at it and come in and kind of say, yeah, I'm adamant, I'll lay down in front of a train that this is base or this is weighted, and really get an idea about, kind of what, we need to do there. Anna, did you raise your hand? Did I see it? Yeah, Anna, go ahead.
And these are in addition to what we already voted on and sent up last week, right?
Yeah, correct. These are not replacements. This is just what we already sent up. And then we're kind of trying to get these knocked out. So we'll have a really formal presentation to submit to them. And then kind of next week, we hammer out what that looks like. I think, like Jen said, I mean, we could have sat here for weeks doing this and really chewed on this to try to figure out, hey, each week we see something different that we might not have seen last week. But as we're moving through this, we want to certainly be respectful of their time and what DOE is doing, and understanding we've got to get something to them. So I think that's really helpful, what we did. And to be honest, I mean, you guys are going to look at me like I'm nuts. I've really enjoyed this process. I think it gives us an opportunity in our community to be able to really sit at the table at the beginning of something potentially that could be very valuable. I'm hoping for our populations that we serve and that we care about and our family members are involved in. And I credit Commissioner Schwinn and others that have said, hey, we need to hear from you, because again, as I've said, she's reached out to me personally, providing feedback around our committee and things that we've submitted. So I know she's reading that. I'm grateful for that. That it's not what I feel like is an exercise in futility. There's a serious tone to this, and I'm glad that you guys are involved in it, and really appreciate the feedback that you've gotten. Senator Powers, Representative Whitson, and others need to hear that, and I need to hear that, and it's good for us to be able to understand community needs, and instead of speculating or creating our own narrative and our own reality to say, well, I know what they need because I saw it on TV, or I heard from one person. It's been really helpful. So Ginger, we're kind of wrapping up there. You want to share anything maybe as a precursor to next week and kind of what the expectation is for us before we wrap up?
So let me put a couple others out there really quickly. So
Sure.
For those who had shared some feedback through email, gifted endorsed educators and gifted endorsed district coordinator came out as, some specific areas. So I'm going to plan to include those in this recommendation as well, unless you all vote no. So please put some feedback in the chat to me if this goes against what the group would want, or take yourself off mute, so I can make sure that I'm representing the will of the group.
Can you read those aloud again? I don't have access to the chat through my Microsoft Teams for some reason.
Absolutely. Gifted endorsed educators and then gifted endorsed district coordinator. This may be moving a little bit into the side of spending, but it came out as important to several of you guys. So
Yep.
we're gonna include it on there if that seems like it's still a priority for the group.
Yeah, that was what Ginger's referencing. One of the ones that was one of the ones that just about everybody, I think, prioritized that one as, hey, this is a must-have type deal. And you can see it's still coming in that way. So that's good feedback, because that's consistent with what we just saw.
Okay.
And what says psychologist, that's already listed in the draft, so we don't need to address that.
Right.
Yes, and we also submitted that one last time as well.
Yep.
And then the last one that I wanted to get your all's quick thoughts on is, there were a couple areas where you guys had raised up funding for professional development or training. And I think in thinking through that funding versus spending plan, would you all want to prioritize funding for professional development, period? And then, there may be a place later where there is, consideration for what that might be, or is that a conversation you want to have at another time? I think the spending part is when we start defining those things that gets into more of like the spending conversation. But is there a place to have professional development as part of this, a component that you all would want to put into the formula? Leanne says yes. Anna, go ahead.
I think it's important, especially because so many of our people don't understand our myriad of disabilities. And I think for our kids to be successful, it's extremely critical that there be professional development around disabilities for our general education teachers and our school administrators around dyslexia, giftedness, autism, so many.
Okay. Since several people agree, that's something we want to include there. So we'll list it as professional development, and then we'll just put some examples kind of over at the side like we had in the notes that you all have before, of those areas that you all see as the most important ones to have that professional development around. I think that hits several of our areas. So again, as Anna mentioned, this would be on top of the things that we shared last time. So this isn't replacing any of those things. Right. It would be on top of that. So I think that is it for this one. If there's any like reflection or anything that we need to do whole group on this draft formula, like Brad, I'll leave that up to you if you want to open the floor to that for these last few minutes. There's not really anything specific for the next meeting yet, other than what I shared at the beginning. If you can see some of those policy considerations we'll talk about next time on the meeting 5 document.
Yeah, and that's really what I was just going to kind of wrap the meeting up with for this group, was if you can please go back to make sure that we review the document for what's coming up for the next meeting. That's going to be the last time that we get together. And I think it's going to be really important to provide that feedback so Ginger can kind of give them a formal final document from our subcommittee. So if I can ask kind of a takeaway and action item for all of us, is to make sure to review that document that Ginger has sent out and has shared, and make sure we even go back and review, after Ginger sends this back out, kind of where we are and all the things. To Anna, your point, I think what Ginger and I will do is get everything that we submitted and make sure everybody on this subcommittee is on the same page and remembering what was submitted. So for that conversation next Tuesday, we'll be able to all speak, kind of sing from the same song sheet and remember exactly what we submitted, because instead of obviously, 2 weeks for us to do this, it's a week. And so if you get that from Ginger, please make sure to review it. If you can put some prioritization on your own calendar, even for 15 minutes, one day just to look at it and kind of refresh yourself. I think it'll be helpful as we move forward. Anna?
I'm happy for us to have any other conversations, but in the last 5 minutes before we all sign off, I would love just to talk about the issue that Lori and I had brought up, if there's time, if you don't have anything else on that agenda.
No, go ahead. I mean, we're pretty much wrapped up, so we've got a couple minutes we can chat.
And I think that last week it was great. We sent up dyslexia, characteristics of dyslexia. We voted on it, tying it really to our law. But in the funding, that changed to 504 dyslexia plans.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, that language is something that we're having issues with, because Carol's right, the devil's in the details. And if we get some of these wordings wrong, in special ed law, specific things have very specific ties. So I really feel strongly, and I think it's very reflected in the public comment we've gotten pretty much across the board from parents of dyslexia, that we need characteristics in there and not 504. The way it's written now, 504 dyslexia plan, that's not a thing. 504 plans are a thing, but there's not a 504 dyslexia plan. And I think that does need to tie directly to our law for funding, because what's going to happen with a 504 plan is everyone in this room knows how 504 plans work, but there are barriers, right? We have to go in, we have to request a meeting, we have to have a diagnosis. And for a lot of us, that's going to mean our school, if they are not educated, they're going to send us to our pediatrician to get a diagnosis of dyslexia, which isn't a thing. Then we're going to come back. That's not going to work. We're going to have to go somewhere else to get $1,500. So this really, to me, is discriminatory against a lot of our families and economic disadvantaged parents who don't necessarily know how dyslexia works. So huge concerns for me around that 504 language. 504 is a very important category for sure, but our kids don't really ever get there. So because of some misunderstandings inside the school. So I feel very strongly that that language does need to be tailored to what we voted on to tie into characteristics of dyslexia. I know Penny Schwinn had a concern about auditing, which is a legitimate concern. We want to know where our money is being spent, but we're lucky that the Dyslexia Advisory Council actually codes kids as having characteristics of dyslexia, which is what we present to our legislature every year as a committee. So they're already coded that way. So we very clearly can find who these kids are for that auditing and accountability of funding. So those are my 2 cents.
No, great feedback. Thank you. Hey, Lori, I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I obviously agree with Anna. I just want to point out that it is measurable. You can tie it, and also this is state law. It's state law that's not being funded, and it was voted on unanimously by the House and Senate. So it's not. It was never. It is state law. It supersedes other things that we think are priorities because it is law. And so, the feedback that was given definitely confuses the situation for parents, for teachers, so it does need to remain with characteristics. That's how the law was set up. And some of those students will never, ever see a 504, but they still have to have the appropriate intervention. We're at, let's call it 34 to 36% third grade reading level. Those kids never learn to read by the time they graduate. So we're graduating 90+% students. They didn't magically learn to read between 3rd grade and 12th grade. We're graduating kids, calling them college and career ready, and they can't read on an appropriate grade level. So it is important. I realize that the word dyslexia, some people take offense to or have struggles with. This law is set up to catch lots of kids, not just the ones who are fully, profoundly dyslexic, but the kids who just need a little help, it's going to catch them as well. So that's why the characteristics is there instead of a full-blown diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. No, good feedback, Lori. Thank you. Carol, you want to wrap us up here? We got about 30 seconds.
Right. I just wanted to put a placeholder in 504 because that's going to be on my list when we talk about how we weight students with disabilities. Just want to remind us that 504 plans, or that section 504 applies to all students. It applies to students with disabilities. You don't have to have a diagnosis, but for kids who don't reach the level of needing an IDEA, IEP, for example. And we need to consider that as we think about weights. And so I just wanted to put a placeholder on that because I'll be bringing that up. Thank you.
No, that's good. No, absolutely. Senator Powers, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I'm not wrapping it up, but I just want to say, Lori, I appreciate what you said. And I can tell you, I don't know how many times I've heard it out of the governor's office, is that pre-K through third grade is where children should learn to read. And then from 3 through 12 is when they read to learn. So I think it's important that we get it right from the pre-K through 3 in order for kids to graduate at a high level and go on to bigger and better things. But good to see you, Laurie.
Yep. All right. Well, I appreciate you guys again. Thank you again for jumping on and participating and being active members of our committee. Ginger and I will work to get something out to you. When I say Ginger and I really mean Ginger, because she's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And I want to publicly again thank Ginger for the work that she's done for our subcommittee. She's done a wonderful job. And I know she's wearing a lot of hats, but certainly appreciate what she's done for us. So publicly thanking Ginger for that.
I'd like
And I'll speak for our group.
Probably thank all the parents of disabilities who sent in
Yeah.
so many comments. I mean, there was
Yeah.
a lot of them, and they were very touching and moving. So I really appreciate, shout out to everyone who's watching and following along and doing this work alongside of us.
No, great point. It takes always we always want one more than we have, right? In participating in civics and these conversations, they're that important. So I will we'll wrap it up and we will see you guys next Tuesday. Hope everybody has a good rest of your afternoon. See ya.
Thank you.